Blessings be upon you. What a privilege it is to celebrate the achievement of probably the most important ingredient of the African diaspora, and that is Black women. I am so amazed at the overcoming the odds of using both mind, spirit, soul to accomplish amazing things. You know my testimony. My mother, bless her heart, 96 years old, Mary Keels, made so many sacrifices for her seven children. All she told us was that tomorrow will only be brighter if you are serious about today. And she would say things that often made me think about there's got to be more to life than just being here. She said, son, when you discover your purpose, God placed you in this planet in the first place. And one of the things I never could understand until I got older was that of all the things that we talk about in emancipation, et cetera, no one had more of a dynamic impact than Black women being able to sustain a movement, which really wasn't even intended to set them free. The average person doesn't even know that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free Black women. It's a very significant thing to do, but nevertheless, some of the greatest minds, some of the greatest innovators, some of the greatest theologians of the 20th century have come from the ranks of Black women because they saw God in a tangible way, God in a way in which the theodicy made more sense than just going through the motions of being church. And we have an extraordinary gifted person this morning as our presenter. And I'm going to let Dr. Holland tell you her story. But the one thing I'm very proud of is that we both have that Yale Divinity School connection. And when I saw that, I kind of smiled and beamed because I know the caliber of brothers and sisters who were able to survive Yale, number one, but to be able to thrive at Yale is even more amazing, which means that your mind must be sharp, your ability to deal with patience in an institution that is very, very difficult to change. My first day in New Haven, I was reminded by Dean Harry Adams, the original name of New Haven, Connecticut was New Heaven. That's a very interesting thing. And the Twin Rocks on both sides of the city were for those pilgrims and stuff, a way of them seeing themselves as being sheltered from the world. And then Black folk came. And boy, was that a surprise when we turned Brainerd House into Nat Turner House. When the Erica Hudgens trial began and we had, all kinds of folks staying in the Black house. My colleague in ministry, one of the great educators at Morgan, and even a greater believer in terms of mentoring folk through Navigators Ministry is Dr. Jacqueline Holland, who I'm going to ask to present the presenter this morning. Dr. Holland.
Thank you, Reverend Keels. Good morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning for our Insightful Foundations. Her name is the Reverend Dr. Debora Jackson, and she is Professor of Practice and Dean of the Robert A. Fosse Business School at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. It's a STEM institution, STEM standing for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math. And it's based on recognition of project-based education that integrates theory and practice of management. And Dr. Jackson, in seeing the society and the changing needs, her mission is to promote research, collaboration, and partnerships that understand broader societal needs and recast the vision for business education in ways that prepare leaders to disrupt, reorient, and innovate for societal impact. Dr. Jackson is a known leader. She's been director of several organizations. She was director of operations of All Girls Aloud, which I think as we're celebrating Women's History Month, that All Girls Aloud is a faith-based nonprofit organization that's committed to restoring life, value, and dignity to women by providing resources that promote healing and wholeness. Dr. Jackson has also been director of lifelong learning at Yale Divinity School. She was also the executive director of the Ministers Council of the American Baptist Churches USA. Dr. Jackson has worked in business for 20 years with an emphasis on IT and software, or she worked in business with an emphasis on IT and software engineering before heeding to the call of the ministry. Her key roles that she held during that time included Chief Operating and Chief Information Officer of an e-commerce energy services provider and as Managing Director of a supply chain and IT consulting group. I met Dr. Jackson a few months ago in a leadership program that I'm involved in, and she was one of our speakers. We actually read her book. She's an author of several articles and 2 books. One that's called Men for Good, Fundamentals in Womanist Leadership, and that's the book that I read. That is awesome. It's hope you'll take the time to read it. I'll put that information in the chat box. And also Spiritual Practices for Effective Leadership, 7 R's of Sanctuary for Pastors. And so, Dr. Jackson, we just welcome you today to Morgan State University, our Memorial Chapel, and for our Insight Foundations. And we're looking forward to you sharing your story of being a scientist, a leader, a woman feminist leader, and also a faith leader. So welcome.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Holland. What a generous introduction. Dean Keels, I'm so grateful to make this connection. I think that it will not be the last time that we connect. To each of you who have joined, a special shout out to my parents, who I'm just so grateful would take the time, even though they've heard this talk already, that they would come anyway. And I would also acknowledge in absentia, but I expect that she might join in as my stepdaughter, who is Morgan State, Dr. Alicia Thomas, class of 2012. So very proud to be able to bring all of my lives together in this conversation. Insightful foundations. And so hopefully you can see my screen and I'll share. But I wanted to be able to tell my story and linking all of these threads together and perhaps elicit in you your own sense of story, because as a womanist, theologian, and leader, as a African-American woman, it comes to me back to story. So the question that I have today for you is, what is your leadership story? What characterizes your leadership? I mean, most of us haven't thought about this question because it's not posed too often, but if you think about how you lead, what are the traits from which you draw that leadership, and where did it come from? See, when I was in school and moving as an engineer, I graduated with a business degree. My focus was in IT and manufacturing systems. I moved from the Midwest to the Northeast to Massachusetts to become a software engineer and quickly moved through the ranks to become an engineering manager. But when I became a manager, I realized that, I tried to be the kind of leader that people expected. In an engineering context, in a scientific context, people expected me to be technical and rational and hard and persuasive and convincing and that kind of larger than life picture, image to command and direct. But it wasn't me. It wasn't me. I really struggled to try to be that person. And in fact, even when I found myself trying to lead like that, I got angry with my team one day and said, we have to do this, and this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it. And one of my engineers actually said, oh, you're cute when you're angry. I couldn't pull it off, right? And I couldn't pull it off because I realized as I started to think about my concept of leadership that it came from this westernized model of leadership, which was very much Eurocentric, androcentric, meaning male dominated, and it expect white male dominated, which meant that you needed to be rational and goal dominated and hierarchical and technocratic, quantitative, all of these things that were hard. And what does that leadership style say? How does that leadership style work? Well, it works mostly for commanding looking white guys. It discounts others' experiences because it preferences that way of leading above all else. And it preferences that kind of leadership because that's what's seen as good management. That's what's seen as positive. If you even look back at the previous presidential administration, why was that compelling to some? Because it was the kind of leadership that said, I alone can fix it. I alone can solve it. And too many people kind of drank the Kool-Aid of that style of leadership, right? That male dominated view. Well, I couldn't do that. So what was commended instead? Oh, a feminine leadership style. And this kind of promotes the 90s way of leading, the feminine advantage, which came out as a major leadership book. And what that style said, oh, we should be flatter, matrix organizations that really key in on how women lead, and how women are supposed to lead are passive and nurturing. We're relationship oriented, grounded in female values. We are the maternal kind of leader that brings chocolate chip cookies to our team meetings and makes it long, right? Well, I couldn't quite do that either because that leadership style really treats all women as though they are white middle class, as the standard bearer, right? It sets up an either or dichotomy. What do I mean? It expects that we'll be tough and or nurturing. It's that idea of we've got a iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. And it still is subordinated as a leadership style when people are expecting you to be tough and quantitative and male dominated. It really leaves most women feeling like they need to be Wonder Woman and do all for everything and everybody. So that doesn't work. So where then do I turn? What do I look to try to find my own authentic voice in leadership in this very technical, engineering, male dominated environment? I plumb the depths for my own story, my own story. And this is true when you think about people of color, people of the African diaspora, people of indigenous cultures here in North America. One of the reasons that we were discounted was because our cultures are the ocean, and a European male dominated culture didn't respect the value of an oral tradition. But it's as we tell our story, we start to hear and understand who we are and how we lead. My story, and who are depicted on the screen, none of whom I ever met, but whose lives were cast and embedded on my parents, who then imparted into me. So my grandmother, Edith Curry Jackson, lived in Elkhart, Indiana, which is where I hail from. And in the mid 1950s, as the story goes, she was shopping in downtown Elkhart, Indiana. Indiana, very conservative Midwestern state, Elkhart being a very conservative Midwestern town. But as she was walking downtown Elkhart, Indiana, she passed a department store, and what she saw stopped her in her tracks. There was this beautiful white woman on display next to a brand new washing machine, and her hand was out. She was in her dress, in her pearls, by this washing machine. And next to her, for contrast, was this fat, black, mechanized Aunt Jemima looking woman laboring over a scrub board. And it was mechanized to the point that the woman had the nerve to be kind of chunking up and down over the scrub board with her clothing. That was the contrast by this new washing black subordinated stereotype. Well, my grandmother saw that and she was hot. She walked into the store and demanded to see the manager, told the manager when he came, you need to take that display down. We wash our clothes just like everybody else. You take that display down. And she told him that she was going to finish her shopping, but she would be back to the store, and expected that the display would be taken down by the time she returned. Well, my grandmother was 4 feet 11, if that. She wasn't very imposing, and certainly this white department store manager didn't give her a second thought. So she left, she went shopping, she came back, nothing was changed. So my grandmother decided to climb into the storefront window, and she used her pocketbook, as they called it back in the day, to display with her pocketbook. And of course, the store manager was horrified and angry, immediately called the police, and she dared them, I'm sure, saying, fine, call them, I'm not going anywhere. And of course, the police came and they leaned over her, trying to be and frightening, and said, now Edith, because of course they weren't going to call her Mrs. Jackson, now Edith, you know you ought not be doing that. Well, my grandmother shoved her chin up and said, and they ought not be lying on us like this either. We wash our clothes just like everybody else. Like I said, I never met my grandmother. She died before I was born. But when my family told the stories, right, these are the things that came up out of the story to impress me. These were the stories that you heard when the old folks would, and the older women would shuck beans and pick greens on the front porch. These were the stories that I heard when my mother had me between her knees braiding my hair. These were the stories that I heard my uncles and my aunts laugh about as the family got together. These that became part of me, and what I lifted out of these stories were they weren't called leadership. My grandmother might not have thought, but I heard leadership in her story. I heard courage in her story. I heard an ability to speak truth to power in her story that became part of me. So our story to understand who we are. Then once we reclaim our story of our oppression and oppression that continues to mark and mar our lives even to this day. The lasting impacts of enslavement. I know there are lasting impacts, but also then you enslavement deemed us as ugly, regarded us as property to exploit. And even now, Black women in enslavement was so significant that even to the Gates research confirms enslavement are currently 24% or more European. That is a direct impact of the rape, white supremacy. And this is specific to the church because it was the church that has much to atone for when we think about the codification of race and the discrimination that results from it, because it was the church that held up whiteness as God's standard of perfection, whiteness as what God intended for humanity. And with each color of race that was removed and abstracted from whiteness, that is what was defined as antithetical to God's perfected humanity. Therefore, it was codified and 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 instantiated based on biblical proof texting that we would be inferior and incapable. And then that became the caricature that lives today, even in what we see in modern day life. Mammy, I don't have to tell you who Mammy was, Gone with the Wind. We think, oh, Mammy, that doesn't happen, that nobody still regards Black women like Mammy. Well, maybe you saw the Gain Flings commercial recently on television where you have, no, she's not wearing a do-rag, but you have an overweight Black woman standing in the middle of a grocery store sniffing Gain, as if that is supposed to be the end all be all. That's Mammy in the modern day context. Jezebel, she still lives. She's the hypersexualized Black woman. That's what made it supposedly acceptable and not rape to take advantage and exploit Black women through the ages. Why? Because she's got to have it. All that based on that Jezebel concept. And then Sapphire, that woman from Amos and Andy fame from radio and then later television, the emasculating shrew who would cut any man down to size. Well, she is the angry Black woman. All of these stereotypes still stay in the social consciousness to hold us down. So we have to understand that history of oppression. We have to understand our history from our mother lines, and we need to glean from it in order to determine who we might then be. And what do we do when we do that? We craft a culture of resistance and perseverance that is real and is manifest in Black women. And I have to pull this from Sister Maya Angelou, who said, "You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, oh, I rise, I rise, I rise. You cannot hold a Black woman down. And we draw on all that we have to make a difference in our cultures, in our families, in our community, in our society. How do I pull that together? Well, I'm an engineer, I'm a scientist, so there's got to be some theory and some academics behind this. And the theory and academics comes in by looking at 3 points. First is womanism, right? Womanism, it was a construct that was defined by Alice Walker in her book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, right? She introduces this term, and I love the definition. It's kind of a dictionary type definition that Alice Walker provides, but I love how Clenora Hudson Weems puts it in her book of Africana Melanated Womanism. She categorizes this concept into 18 different ways of being. 18's too many to remember. So I've boiled that, distilled that down into 4. Who she is. A womanist is self-naming, she's self-defining, spiritual and whole. That's who she is. How she functions in the world, well, she's mothering, she's family centered, she's nurturing, she's male compatible. And I love that because it distinguishes us from feminists. Feminism has historically, see, feminism was a construct developed by white women who were functioning under patriarchy. But we are not just limited by patriarchy as white women are. We also have to deal with gender issues and class issues. So womanism is inclusive of male. It's inclusive and respectful of elders. How is a womanist viewed? She's respected. Why? Because she's strong, she's authentic, and she's recognized for that authenticity. And then how she works in the world, she's flexible, she's adaptable, she's ambitious and can be a leader, but she also understands how to be a follower. And she's in concert with males in the liberation struggle. So you see concepts of what was a traditional male way of operating, a traditional female way of operating, but womanism is cross-cutting. So I think it's more expansive and representative of who we are and who we've had to be in society as Black women. That's one aspect of the theory. A second aspect of the theory comes from feminist standpoint theory. Now, this is not a new concept, but what it does, feminist standpoint theory leverages an idea that the production of knowledge or epistemology is seated in who we are, right? What does that mean? It means that my grandmother, my great grandmother, who might have known ways of being and knowing ways of doing, is still knowledge, is still valued. Ways of being, ways of doing that I don't even begin to know. It prizes and promotes what she knew and what she brought to the table, while also prizing and promoting what I bring without demeaning what she brings. Why? Because knowledge is socially situated. There are things that I do not know, that I cannot do, because I don't have that experience, that lived experience. So I need to value those who bring that lived experience. And oftentimes, the way that we operate in the world, we create classes and we create dichotomies where it says, well, because I'm learned, because I have degrees, because I function in certain social circles or economic circles, that what I know is more important than what you know. But it is not. It all has to come to the fore, particularly when we are trying to solve very complex problems, because what I know may not address what is needed in community because I don't have the context and that lived experience. But feminist standpoint theory also suggests that as an historically oppressed, marginalized person, I have an awareness that is greater than those who are not similarly oppressed. What does this mean? As an oppressed minority, I need to understand how the majority functions. I was an engineer. I was a pastor. And we know that the church is guilty as for patriarchy as any other institution, right? I needed to understand how white men functioned, for example, in an engineering context or in a pastoral setting. I needed to understand in the Black church how Black men functioned. I needed to understand how women were viewed and how we were functioned. I needed to understand all of these different contexts and way of being so that I could navigate those systems. And standpoint theory raises up and gives voice and language to a way of being that I always thought was just me being me, but it actually has a name. That's the second aspect. So I talked about womanism, talked about standpoint theory, and now then talking about an expanded dialectic perspective. See, what those other two legs of the stool provide for me is an ability to challenge the contradictions of a dominant system that need to be deconstructed. So when people talk about, well, Black people are inferior and they don't know and they don't have, well, I can talk now intelligently and credibly about how a system has conspired, multiple systems have conspired to keep us down and keep us from knowing. Just wrote a piece, for example, on redlining, right? The practice that started at the turn of the 20th century to disenfranchise Black communities and keep investment from going into Black communities. So Black communities were redlined by the FHA, Federal Housing Authority, that suggested, well, banks shouldn't insure and give mortgages to these certain communities because they were not a good financial risk. Well, now that practice has been so codified that we have created hotspots. When you look at global warming and climate change, to an extent that from satellite imagery, you can see historically redlined districts because they're hotter than the invested in suburbs that surround them. I am able to speak and deconstruct the lasting impacts that continue to hem and hold our communities down, speaking truth to power. I got some of that from my grandmother, but also from the standpoint theory and the idea of womanism. I'm bringing all of that together to create a narrative that allows me to function in this very expanded way for the good of others. I hope you're still with me and you understand where I'm going, because what that does is lead us to a model. I am an academic, but I am also an applied theologian. Theory does nothing, it means nothing if you cannot apply it in a concrete, tangible way. And so this is my application of all of that theory. It starts with a faith foundation. It starts with knowing not only who I am, but whose I am. I am a follower of Jesus Christ who has called and saved me. Therefore, I am functioning out of that foundation, standing on the promises of God, but also a foundation that has poured into me, right? A family that said that I was prized, that I was special, that I was loved, that I was able to do anything because of Christ who strengthens me. Then I bring that together with that intersectional standpoint. That's where the theory kind of comes together with the model, right? That says that I have this expanded perspective, knowing that I'm historically marginalized based on race, based on gender, based on class, but I can bring that perspective together to be inclusive of all of God's children. And then I'm emboldened by girding strategies. What does that mean? Girding strategies are those strategies that upend a oppressive, hegemonic culture that tries to tell me that I am less than, right? My mom and dad are on this call, so telling their story. When they were in college, they told of stories where my mother had a teacher in particular where all Black people in the class had the middle initial of C for colored, so that she would remember just at looking at the names who were colored. And in this woman's mind, colored people weren't able to to succeed and excel. And so they always earned C's in her class. But what would happen in my mother's circle of friends, they would talk about being Black and shining, meaning that they could do great things and achieve more than people believed that they could achieve because of who they were and whose they were. And so they started a saying that they would say to each other, "Pardon my Blackness, I didn't mean to shine." And they didn't mean just being shiny because your mother grabbed you and put Vaseline all over your face. They meant shining with the glory of God, shining because they achieved and excelled beyond what other people thought they could do, and saying that to one another, saying that they could shine. Even to this day, my mother ends her emails to me saying, "Shine." It's a counter hegemonic strategy that lifts me up. Even when there's somebody that thinks I cannot do, I can shine because I can upend the lowered expectations that someone has for me to do exceeding and abundantly more because of a God who redeems me. And what does all of this do? It comes together to make transformational communal impact. You think of the role and work of Black women. We have changed communities. When we didn't have 2 dimes to rub together, we came together with all of the women to bring monies together. I mean, I think of this Wells, who wanted to have her manuscript published, and she couldn't get it published because no one wanted to publish her stories. So Black women came together and pooled their pennies and their dimes, and they published her manuscript. You think of Black women who created schools because they wanted their children to be educated. You think of Black women who came together to form women's clubs and groups, who had mottos that said, "We are lifting as we climb," so that as we go up, everybody else goes up. You have women like Ella Baker, who didn't want to be celebrated all by herself. What she wanted was to galvanize at the grassroots and pour into students so that they would recognize that they could do things themselves. That's how the model is applied and employed. And that's the model of womanist leadership. And that's what I talk about in my book. And Dr. Holland was so gracious to acknowledge it. But one of the quotes that captured me by researchers Clark and Hines says that the values that have helped Black women survive, particularly in the United States, are entirely communicable. when problems seem so solvable and insoluble, and obstacles seem so difficult to overcome, all we need to do is look and learn from the history of women in America. I know my time is growing short, but I'm a Baptist preacher, right? This comes from the story of Joseph, and you know Joseph, you know his story, that he was so beloved by his father. Brothers were jealous of him, sold him off into slavery, and told their father that he had fallen and had been killed. But Joseph went through all of these difficulties, and I don't need to run down the entire narrative, but he ultimately caught the attention of Pharaoh because he could interpret dreams, a God-given gift. And because he could interpret dreams, he helped Egypt be saved from a famine, help them to store up reserves during years of plenty, so that when famine came, they had so much in reserve, so much so that others came from all over the area to get foods. And ultimately, that coming together brought Joseph's brothers to come to him to be saved. And the brothers were afraid that Joseph would retaliate when they found out who he was, and they were afraid to disclose themselves to him. But Joseph said, "You meant to harm me, but what you did, God meant it for good." Doing right now, that's the story of African American women. So many men meant to trot us in the dust, so many meant to cast us aside as incapable, but God meant what God did through us for the good, that we might save others. And that's the story, and that's what we are capable of doing if we will only learn the lessons. Insightful foundations, and it's been a pleasure to share with you today.
What a powerful, powerful, deep river of knowledge. You are an extraordinary witness to what it means to pay attention to one's ancestry. So many times we don't realize that you can derive lifelong lessons by watching those people who maybe you never even met. Your grandmother's story is a fascinating one because it debunks the myths so many of us feel oppressed by. The thing that I would like to ask Dr. Jackson, because something you said, it made so much sense to me, and I'm sure my brother Ken Clark would resonate with this as well. He's a former dean at Cornell of the chapel and Morgan man, and just an extraordinary thinker. Applied theologians. So many times we learn something and never apply it. Typically, college students will learn something, tuck it in their spirit, and then 10 years later, you'll be confronted with a situation where not only do you need it, but it's helped you be able to navigate those waters as a woman of color, and particularly from the church perspective. Um, how difficult was your journey initially in terms of the patriarchal dominance and sometimes the misguided patriarchal dominance of the Black church, and we never ever really want to own up to that. We go to churches that 95% of the people are women, and the leadership has no women. What were your thoughts during that time? How did you navigate that?
It was incredibly difficult because, and I'm grateful to my pastor, um, who recognized that God had called me, one, and that he encouraged me. I mean, that's often number one. challenge because we are told that we're not called, that we're not leaders, that God wouldn't call women, and and so to have someone affirm me right off the bat was huge. But then the other piece of that was really important in my ministerial formation is, like so many Black churches and Baptist context, we were duly aligned. We were aligned with the National Baptist Convention, ABC, and we were aligned with the American Baptist Churches USA. And my pastor knew that the National Baptist Convention would never
Never.
receive me, would never receive me. I'd be turned into a Sunday school
Mhm.
teacher. They clearly would have me get up and sing an A and B selection. They're really happy for me to do that. But I would never be called to pastor. And he steered me toward the American Baptist. And then he helped to steer me to the ABCU. It's a historically white church, where I was the first woman and the first African American. Would still be waiting for a call. And now I get a chance to, kind of speak to my brethren about that, because it's true. To your point, they are leading congregations filled with women and not giving women a chance. But then I also have to take my sisters to, men can be just as challenging. The idea of fantasizing about that man in the pulpit, um, that man that stand in the receiving line, that touch, that squeeze, that hug by that male pastor might be the only male touch that woman gets. So she is as invested in the patriarchy as the men are.
Excellent point. Any questions, anyone for Dr. Jackson? It's a fascinating discussion. You have been exposed to something that I dare say happily, such a consistent, systematic theological approach to life. Your parents should be commended. Just commended. Amazing.
Thank you. And while I'm at it, if there's anybody that has a question, that's fine. I also want to just say shout out to my daughter Alicia Thomas, Dr. Alicia Thomas, who is also here. But especially since she's in.
Good morning. It's a
Anyone?
pleasure to be here.
Thank you, honey.
Dr. Jackson, and I need to leave in like 3 off, but Reverend Kills is gonna take over. But what advice would you give to those of us who are young African American women? We're all in this, university interact with, and I mean not only professors, but we have administrative call who interact with students all the time. Their suggestion to us in mentoring women.
I just encourage us to reach back into our story and affirm our stories. We're helping with this, we're serving, we're not leading, glean from your story and affirm it. That's your standpoint. That's what makes you to God and celebrate.
So that one, I don't want to call in. Would I be curious? I thought Linda Debora was there. Were you? Linda Debora is our acting chair of the Department of Economics.
I want to say I really like Cardi B. And
You know, I think it's a wonderful fit because one of the things that we've done is that, you know, the caricatures that we're labeled with, you know, every now and then we can. So yeah, I won't embarrass myself by, you know, trying to offer any lyrics, but you know some of the songs.
Mhm.
And so she kind of labels and Beyonce as well, that they might be labeled as Jezebel. That might be the entry into the door, but then they use those counter hegemonic strategies, gyrating body. I got something to say and I'm about to run it and rule it in ways that you didn't even expect and didn't even know, because there's so much more to me than what you want to box me in as. And so I think that's brilliant. And I think that Black women have been doing that for forever. Because even when Mammy was being Mammy, you know, watch the movie Gone with the Wind. I mean, she was running the show. White folks thought they were in charge, but Mammy was in charge. And that was what was happening. And we've been doing it since we got here.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Dr. Jackson, I really enjoyed your presentation. I mean, what you just shared with us now kind of reflects the subversive ways in which in the African American experience, and women in particular have been able to really reverse narratives as well as destinies, in ways that have not been fully appreciated. I have a question for you. How would you say distinguish, or is there a distinction between, say, womanist thinking and Black feminist thinking?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. So I referenced Clenora Hudson Weems, and she just completely dislikes the idea of Black feminist concepts. And if you read Alice Walker's definition of womanism, she likens it to as a Black feminist. And the concern that Hudson Weems brings to this discussion is that you cannot talk about your own freedom and your own emancipation by donning the clothes of what would oppress you.
Mhm.
So if feminism still has kind of some oppressive overtones, and we're to don that oppression in order to talk about our freedom. And I think that that has some merit.
Mhm. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
It's certainly been a very, very rich discussion today. And isn't it comforting to know, folk, that we have in our community people who are not only deep thinkers, but have practical life experiences in which to deal with the issues that confront them. I've often dealt with the idea of being able to recognize the traits in others. Until you understand white folk, for instance, and what the theology does, particularly this whole thing about proof texting. We talk about that a lot. I teach a course at Morgan called Religion in the Black Church, and I often challenge my students to understand that translations are just that. Whoever has the pen really gets to tell the story. And if you don't tell the story with accuracy, you can in fact have people believe the truth stops with the translator, but the truth really is in the power of the person who has them translating. So we want to thank again Reverend Dr. Deborah Jackson, just a very deeply committed theologian, engineer, person who makes a really powerful contribution to the landscape in America. Until next time, when we will be able to once again enjoy challenging presenters on challenging topics, we just want to ask everyone to be peaceful, stay safe, stay wrapped up in who you are. You're just the way God wanted you to be. There's no need to change anything about you. And when God made you, God said, that's good. Have a blessed, blessed, blessed day. And we thank you again. And you'll be hearing from me personally soon, because I think I want to get you to come to Morgan to preach on our Sunday night radio broadcast. So I definitely want to hear that.
Bless you. Bless you. Thank
Yeah.
you all.
Thank you all. God bless everybody.
God bless
Peace
you.
You
and
too.
grace.
Take care.
Bye-bye.